For a boy born into the silent, brutal world of a Maryland plantation, the city of Baltimore was another planet. Young Frederick, sent there to serve the family of Hugh Auld, was overwhelmed by the noise, the crowds, and a sight he had never witnessed before: kindness. His new mistress, Sophia Auld, had never owned a slave, and her heart had not yet been turned to stone by the institution. She looked at the bright, inquisitive boy and saw a child. In the beginning, she would sit with him, a small spelling book in her lap, and patiently trace the shapes of the letters A, B, C. To Frederick, these were not just symbols, they were magic. Each one was a crack in the wall of darkness that had surrounded him his entire life. For the first time, hope felt like a real, tangible thing. He was a quick study, his mind a thirsty sponge, and within days he could spell simple words. He was euphoric. The world was beginning to reveal its secrets. The revelation, however, came not from his teacher, but from his master. One day, Hugh Auld entered the room to find his wife instructing the young slave. A storm of fury erupted from him. He snatched the book away, his face contorted with a rage that seemed far greater than the supposed crime. "You must never," he bellowed at his wife, his voice shaking with a terrifying conviction. "If you teach that boy to read, it would forever unfit him to be a slave." He went on, pacing the room, explaining that literacy would only fill a slave with discontent and make him unmanageable. He will want to know, and then he will want to be, and once that happens, he is no longer property. Frederick stood frozen in the corner of the room, but his mind was on fire. Auld's words, meant to be a sentence of perpetual darkness, were instead a blaze of light. In that single violent outburst, his master had revealed the most profound secret of all. The white man's power was locked in those strange, crooked symbols. Literacy was not a simple skill. It was the weapon used to enslave him, and it was the one weapon that could set him free. Auld had not just forbidden him from reading, he had shown him the exact location of the key to his own cage. From that day forward, learning became Frederick's secret war. The classroom was closed, so he made the streets of Baltimore his school. He would carry a piece of bread in his pocket, and when sent on errands, would find the poor white boys who were often hungry. "I'll bet you don't know what that spells," Frederick would challenge, his heart pounding with the thrill of his subterfuge. The boys, eager to show off their knowledge for a bite to eat, would eagerly sound out the words, unwittingly providing the lessons his master had forbidden. He carried a piece of chalk with him, practicing on fences and brick walls when no one was looking, the chalky taste of the letters a sacrament of his secret religion. But with knowledge came a new and terrible burden. It gave him a language for his own agony, and it was an agony that threatened to consume him. He realized Mr. Auld was both right and wrong. Reading had made him unfit to be a slave, but it had not simply made him unhappy, it had made him dangerous. The time for learning was ending. The time for fighting was about to begin.
The world of chalk-marked fences and discarded newspapers in Baltimore vanished like a dream. Frederick was sent back to the countryside, leased to a farmer named Edward Covey. The name was whispered among the enslaved with a special kind of dread. Covey wasn't just a master, he was a specialist. His reputation was for breaking slaves, for taking men and women who showed the slightest spark of defiance and grinding them down into thoughtless, obedient beasts of burden. He was, as Frederick would later call him, a nigger breaker. Covey's methods were insidious. He was not a man of simple, predictable brutality. His cruelty was a form of psychological torture. He was known as the Snake for his ability to appear when least expected, crawling on his hands and knees through the fields to catch a slave resting for even a moment. He worked them from before sunrise to long after sunset, keeping them in a state of perpetual, bone-deep exhaustion. Sleep was a luxury, and food was barely enough to sustain them. Under this relentless assault, the fire that the Columbian orator had ignited in Frederick's soul began to flicker and die. The intellectual world he had built for himself was a fragile defense against Covey's campaign to unmake him. Physical exhaustion clouded his thoughts. The constant gnawing hunger made it impossible to concentrate. The ever-present threat of the whip eroded his spirit. He was being successfully broken. The articulate, questioning young man was being reduced to a creature of instinct and pain. He would look at his reflection in a puddle and see a stranger, a dull-eyed, vacant animal. The bright flame of his intellect was being smothered by the sheer, grinding weight of his physical existence. He had once believed that knowledge made him unfit to be a slave. Now he felt himself becoming the very thing he was supposed to be, a brute. The breaking point came one sweltering August day. Frederick, weak with fever and exhaustion from working in the wheat threshing fan, collapsed. Covey, finding him, did not offer aid. He kicked him viciously in the ribs, and when he struggled to rise, struck him on the head with a thick hickory slat, leaving a deep gash. Covered in blood and shaking with ague, Frederick was ordered back to work. Something inside him snapped. He made a desperate decision and fled, not to escape, but to appeal to his official master, Thomas Auld, 7 miles away. He arrived at Auld's house, a bloody, half-dead wreck, and begged to be removed from Covey's charge. Auld listened, considered the financial arrangement, and refused. Frederick was property, and the contract with Covey was binding. He was ordered to return to the farm by morning to face Covey's wrath. That night, walking back, was the darkest of his life. He had been failed by the law, by his master, and by his own body. He hid in the cornfields, knowing a terrible punishment awaited him. For a day he nursed his wounds and his despair. He was broken. The man who had learned to write had been erased. But as he lay there in the dirt, something shifted. The despair curdled into a cold, hard knot of rage. An animal, when cornered, does not reason. It fights. He would not be whipped again. What happened next was not a punishment. It was a battle. For nearly 2 hours they fought. They were witnessing the unthinkable, a black man refusing to be broken. The fate of every person on that farm hung in the balance, resting on the outcome of this bloody, desperate fight for dominance.
The fight in the stable ended, not with a final blow, but with a stalemate born of exhaustion and shattered authority. Covey, bruised, bleeding, and unable to overpower the man he was meant to break, finally staggered away, panting for breath. He never spoke of the fight, he never reported it, and most importantly, he never again laid a hand on Frederick Douglass. To admit that he had been physically bested by a slave would have destroyed his reputation as a nigger breaker.
Frederick had won more than a fight. He had won a psychological war. He had forced his master to treat him as a man. The battle, he realized, had rekindled the dying embers of his spirit and revived his sense of manhood. He was no longer a slave in his own mind. This spiritual liberation reignited his insatiable thirst for physical freedom. After his term with Covey ended, he began to secretly organize. He started a small, clandestine school for his fellow slaves, teaching them to read from a single spelling book, sharing the forbidden power he had fought so hard to possess. He and a small group of trusted men planned a daring escape by canoe, but they were betrayed. Seized and thrown into jail, Frederick faced the near certainty of being sold into the Deep South, a fate worse than death. Yet fate intervened. His master, Thomas Auld, perhaps seeing more trouble in this defiant slave than he was worth, sent him back to Baltimore. There, working in the shipyards, Frederick found a new opportunity. With the help of Anna Murray, a free black woman who would become his wife, he devised a new plan. Dressed as a sailor, carrying borrowed papers, Frederick boarded a train. Every stop, every question from a conductor was a moment of heart-stopping terror. But the disguise held. On September 3, 1838, after a journey of 24 agonizing hours, Frederick Douglass stepped onto the soil of New York City. He was a free man. The feeling was not of immediate joy, but of profound disorientation and overwhelming relief. He was a fugitive, alone and without resources, but the chains were finally broken. He and Anna settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts, a whaling port with a thriving abolitionist community. For the first time, he was surrounded by men and women, black and white, who spoke openly against the institution that had defined his life. Yet he remained silent, listening. The scars of his past ran deep. In 1841, he attended an abolitionist convention. He was unexpectedly asked to speak, to say a few words about his life as a slave. He hesitated. To speak was to expose himself, to relive the trauma. But then he stood up. He opened his mouth and the story poured out. His voice, filled with a power and eloquence forged in secret study and brutal experience, held the audience spellbound. In that moment, Frederick Douglass found his true calling. His voice was his new weapon. But a spoken story could be dismissed as rumor. To truly fight slavery, he had to do the most dangerous thing imaginable. He decided to write and publish his life story. In 1845, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, was released. It was an act of audacious defiance. In its pages, he named his masters, described the locations of the plantations, and detailed the brutalities he had endured. He was not just telling a story. He was presenting a legal testimony against his captors, daring them to come and reclaim their property. He was a man in hiding who had just handed his enemies a map. He held the book in his hands, the physical manifestation of his entire journey. The chalk letters on the Baltimore streets, the secret readings by moonlight, the bloody fight in the stable, it was all there, forged into an object that could cross borders, enter parlors, and expose the lie of slavery to a world that had chosen to look away. He had stolen the master's most powerful tool, and now he was wielding it against him. The man who learned to write his way to freedom was now poised to help write the story of freedom for millions. His war had just begun. With ink instead of chains, Douglass carved his name into history, and there was no master alive who could erase it.
If you found this story powerful, please support our work. Like the video, share it with others, And don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories.